Good evening, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to 2024 elections. My vote, my choice. My name is Faraz Patel. Yes, the penultimate week of the 2024 national and provincial elections. Today, we don't have a political party, but we've got two very key institutes that we're going to be speaking to with regards to looking ahead to the polls. Now, as South Africa celebrates 30 years of democracy, there have been many strides, especially when it's come to the enhancement of the constitution. But many challenges remain in terms of socio-economic problems, from inequality to a lack of economic freedom. 30 years on, the 2024 elections present citizens a chance to change their future, and this will be that important for them. Joining us now, I'd like to welcome senior researcher for the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in South Africa, Thembelani Mazibuko. Thembelani, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here on Hilaal TV.
Thank you so much, Faraz. Thank you for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thembelani, 30 years on, where do you see our democracy?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So there's no question about the fact that South Africa has come a long way. Nobody can deny that. What we were then and where we are now, South Africa is a much better place to live. Um, a lot of it has been due to very important interventions by the ruling party. So policies and often forgotten policies such as RDP, which electrified millions of households, providing also basic water, building of housing. There's also been interventions with regard to access to higher education through NSFAS. Empowerment laws such as affirmative action and Black economic empowerment have ensured that previously disadvantaged South Africans are able to get access to the economy. So there have been some very important interventions that the ruling party can be proud of in terms of changing South Africa economically, politically, and socially. The question is now: has South Africa advanced enough? Has it done enough? And that really is what in many ways, this election is about. There is still persistent inequality, and that leads to a number of consequences, such as crime, as well as other downstream social ills. So while we have come a long way, there is still some ways to go, and that a lot of that will be litigated in these upcoming elections.
Thembelani, you mentioned about, some of the social ills within South Africa. And you would know because obviously you hear from word on the street here at Hilaal TV. We've been getting word on the street. Two things that really irk South Africans, of course, crime, the lack of equality that is amongst the citizens, but also economic freedom. And those are, I think, three of maybe some of the 10 social ills that we're having right now in South Africa. And I guess citizens have every right to feel that way, given that, when it was 1994, there was a sense of euphoria. 30 years on, that euphoria has completely waned away, not just slowly waned away.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing this with the fragmentation of the support of the ruling party from the highs of the early to mid 2000s, when the ruling party, there was this euphoria that you speak about, when the ruling party was getting really easy two-thirds majority in terms of the national vote. Since the mid to late 2000s, there has been this loss of hope, as you can say, and it's really captured in the rise of political parties that are more to the left, promising more radical change. Political parties such as the Economic Freedom Fighters, chief amongst which, also a lot's been said about the rise of MK, but a lot of it can really be attributed to a sense that there has been a significant portion of South African society that has been left behind and are therefore understandably drawn by a rhetoric, by a more radical rhetoric that speaks to their lived experiences. So, really, the economic challenge, and also with regards to young people, that is why they're disproportionately voting for a lot of these parties, such as the EFF. They bear the brunt of of unemployment, of lack of job opportunities. But at the same time, the interventions like NSFAS have enabled some young people, such as myself, to gain access to higher education, to gain access to formal employment. So South Africa's story really is a double-edged sword
mm.
where some people's lives have gotten better, but there is a large swathe of the population who remain behind due to a number of factors.
Thembelani, let's look at, of course, the polls itself, and a lot of the work that you do is trying to make sure that the elections sustains the democracy that we have in South Africa and the maintenance of it. We saw over the weekend so many South Africans from outside the borders of the country going and casting their vote. And that just shows that the appreciation of the South African democracy and the constitution still lives within them, even if they're not here within our borders.
So I would like to beg in
Mm,
some ways to differ with that statement. Yes, of course, we saw very
mm,
long lines in
mm,
London where people were eager to vote.
mm,
But to give some context, there is north of over 200,000 people living in the United Kingdom,
mm,
whereas the figure was about 34,000 in terms of the people who've registered.
mm,
So not who voted, registered. Um, the last figure I heard was 68% in terms of people who were registered. So you can say it's about 20,000 people
mm,
out of over 200,000 living in the UK who voted. So that's about plus minus 10%. Also in New York, in the United States, there was figures of in the low 40s, high 30s. So that really does in many ways speak to the challenges of overseas voting, in that they can only vote, if you're in the UK, you can
yes.
only vote in London. So if you live far off, it may be more of a challenge for you to vote. Of course, we saw some South Africans, and I saw the interviews of people who traveled
Mm,
overnight, who traveled 3, 4, 5 hours to vote. So these are the kinds of people that you refer to. But it's interesting that you speak on overseas voting because of the rules changes and the introduction of a third ballot. This year, the overseas votes will effectively be worth half of what it was of what it was worth last year, 5 years ago when you last voted. So there's some implications to the change in the rules. Chief amongst which, to your point about overseas voting,
mm.
is that the overseas ballots will only count for half than what it did last year, 5 years ago. Sorry.
Yes. Tabelani, has there been enough voter education? I ask this because I think both you and I will say that there is a bit of a disappointment with regards to the number of people that have registered to vote. Now, you speak to some elders, some youngsters, they say, well, my vote's not going to make a choice. If I vote for the same party or I vote for an opposition party, my life is going to be the same. How do you strike that balance of caring and being a patriotic South African to also at the same time understanding that there is no quick fix to South Africa?
Yeah, so on the issue of voter education, so this election is consequential in the sense that there will be some rules changes,
Mm,
some consequential rules changes, chief amongst which, from this year, you can only vote at the voting station you registered.
mm,
Previously, if I am from KwaZulu-Natal,
mm,
and if I'm registered in KZN and I vote in Gauteng, I can be given the national ballots, but I can't vote in
mm,
Gauteng. Now you have to vote where you are registered. To your point on voter education, oh, well over 1 million people in the last 5 years ago voted in in registration voting stations where they are not registered.
mm,
And there's a serious question mark whether people are aware that they can now only vote where they're registered. In other
mm,
words, they cannot vote in another part of the province. Indeed, they cannot vote in another part of the country. And I have been on the record raising this issue,
mm,
including to the chairperson of the commission himself, that this new rule effectively disenfranchises well over 1 million South Africans. And when you look, millions of South Africans who would register to vote, who would vote where they are not registered. And when you look at the figures, so the IEC says that you have up to the 17th of May to notify the IEC if you're going to vote where you
mm,
are not registered. That deadline passed a few days
mm,
ago, and looking at the preliminary figures, um, nowhere near 1 million people have taken advantage of this, either because they do not know or do they feel it's going to be cumbersome. So, in the absence of voter education, which I do not think has been enough to notify people of this rules change, you will see a lot of chaos on voting day, where people are going to be very shocked to find out that they cannot vote because they are not at the voting station where they have registered. So voter education has not been enough, but at the same time, the bigger issue is the wisdom of this rules change by the IEC and by the parliament.
Now, if what you're saying is true, Thembelani, it's going to be a nightmare for those volunteers who are going to be at the polling stations. Thembelani, thank you so much for joining us here on Elections 2024. We much appreciated. Chat to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me. Look forward to joining you.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. That's Thembelani Mazibuko. He is a senior researcher at the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in South Africa. Now, after the break, we're going to be talking polling. What's the data with regards to polling? I'll be speaking to Marie Harris from Ipsos, and she'll be giving us an idea of how they go ahead and conduct their polls 1 week before the elections. Do stay tuned.